Imagine a train, not just, steel and steam, but one carrying the weight of imperial ambition, religious fervor, and this really audacious bid for world power, a bid that would echo for decades.
We're talking about Germany's Drang nach Osten, that famous push to the east.
Exactly. And it's all epitomized by this grand, almost mythical dream, the Berlin-Baghdad Express.
It's a story that's just so much grander and, frankly, more complex than most people realize. It pulls together this truly bewildering cast of characters. You've got emperors, chancellors, explorers, archaeologists, even tribal sheikhs are involved.
Sounds incredible.
And this particular deep dive, it really sets the stage for global conflicts, for realignments that fundamentally shape the modern Middle East as, well, as we know it today.
You've really set the stage there. What strikes me immediately is just this audacity, though, the sheer scale of the ambition involved.
It's huge.
So today, we're taking a deep dive into this fascinating and often, bewildering history of Germany's entanglement with the Ottoman Empire, right on the eve of and then during World War I.
And our journey, it draws heavily from Sean McMeekin's really meticulous work, the Berlin-Baghdad Express, the Ottoman Empire and Germany's bid for world power.
Right, and we'll try to unpack how these grand visions clash, sometimes pretty violently, with the complex realities on the ground, how an infidel European power tried to weaponize holy war.
Well, that's just a whole story in itself.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And the shocking, often deeply tragic, unintended consequences that just reshape the Middle East and well beyond.
What's truly fascinating here, I think, is that intricate dance between these, big geopolitical ambitions and these deeply ingrained cultural and religious identities. It's almost like a masterclass, really, in how propaganda, when it's wielded clumsily or maybe more dangerously, without a true nuanced understanding of the people it's aimed at, can be both incredibly powerful in the short term and just tragically misguided in its long-term impacts.
And it's not just distant history, is it? I mean, this narrative offers surprisingly potent insights into today's complex global landscape.
Absolutely.
The pursuit of quick strategic gains, especially when they involve manipulating deep-seated identities or, bypassing local sovereignty, well, that can have far-reaching unforeseen impacts on the world map, on human lives.
It really resonates.
So what does this all mean for you, listening? It means understanding the historical roots of many current geopolitical tensions, the enduring, sometimes dangerous power of ideology, and the often unpredictable chain reactions of international diplomacy. Okay, let's unpack this.
Where should we start? The railway itself.
Let's kick things off with the building, actually. A monumental piece of architecture that served as both a gateway and, well, a really bold statement. Haydarpaşa Station in Constantinople, modern Istanbul, of course.
Ah, yes, Haydarpaşa. McMeekin describes it as nothing short of a masterpiece of German architecture of the late Wilhelmine era.
And it wasn't just some simple train shed, was it?
No, it was imposing, almost cathedral-like. Apparently, it rests on over 1,000 massive wooden piles driven deep into the earth by these state-of-the-art steam hammers. Yeah, supporting a cutting-edge steel carcass system. It was top-of-the-line engineering for the time.
But it's important to remember, like you said earlier, this wasn't just functional. Impressive engineering, yes, but Haydarpaşa was more. It was a potent symbol.
Almost a physical flag planted on Ottoman soil, wasn't it?
Exactly. It projected Germany's, well, astonishing confidence, McMeekin calls it, and a distinct crusading imperial spirit right there at the turn of the 20th century.
Its sheer grandeur, the dramatic setting overlooking the Golden Horn, the Bosphorus, it perfectly captured the allure of that era where Europe was projecting its power globally.
The author even calls it a reproach to the bland mediocrity of the present age. Suggests a kind of lost ambition, maybe.
Perhaps. It really does embody national aspirations, doesn't it? You think about America's manifest destiny pushing west.
Right, or Russia's relentless expansion into Siberia and Central Asia.
But this German Drang nach Osten, this push east, it had a kind of unique economic logic behind it.
How so?
Well, it aimed to integrate the Ottoman Empire's moribund economy, as they saw it, with Europe's industrial powerhouse, Germany's powerhouse, specifically.
So in that sense, McMeekin argues it was economically a good deal more sensible than the chaotic, mad European scramble for Africa.
Yeah, the Kaiser's vision, romantic as it might have been, was about bringing subjects who weren't seen as primitive tribesmen into a modern, integrated economic sphere. Economic penetration married to imperial ambition.
That's a really crucial distinction. And the transition from that powerful architectural symbol to the individual driving the ambition
Kaiser Wilhelm II.
is seamless. He wasn't just funding these things from afar. He was personally investing, sometimes maybe impulsively.
Oh, definitely impulsively at times. Investing his diplomatic capital, lending his imperial presence to the cause.
And what an investment. That unprecedented state visit to Constantinople, November 1889. It sent shockwaves across Europe, didn't it?
Instantly confirmed Russia's worst fears about German intentions in the Near East. Russia had always seen the Ottoman Empire, its eventual breakup, as being within its sphere.
And then his 1898 tour, going all the way to Damascus, that really marked a seismic shift in German foreign policy, a move away from Bismarck's caution. Precisely. Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor, he'd famously kept this cool and careful indifference to the Orient. His priority was European stability, avoiding Eastern entanglements.
But with Wilhelm II, we get what the author colorfully calls emotional improvisations of amateur hour.
Huh. Yeah, less about concrete, calculated strategy, more about what McMeekin terms dalliance, a kind of flirtatious, less disciplined engagement.
Yet these actions, even if they were improvisational, they had momentous consequences, didn't they, for the European strategic balance? Pushed Russia and Britain closer together, ironically.
Momentous is an understatement. Just think about that Damascus speech, November 8, 1898.
Right, tell us about that. Wilhelm pays this gushing tribute to this great Sultan Saladin, calling him one of the most chivalrous rulers of all times, a knight without fear or fault. Bold enough already, aligning himself with this revered Muslim figure.
Okay.
But then he audaciously declares that the German Kaiser would be their friend for all time. Their, meaning Sultan Abdul Hamid and his 300 million Muslim subjects scattered across the earth.
Wow. 300 million, that's ambitious.
It's an astonishing claim. Coming from a Christian sovereign, it was absolutely shocking. He was effectively meddling in the internal affairs of other colonial powers.
Like France with North Africa or Britain with India.
Exactly. All those Muslim subjects under their rule. It was an open challenge.
So it really begs the question, had Kaiser Wilhelm, gone around the bend with this grandstanding?
In a way, it was a calculated, albeit incredibly risky move, trying to harness religious sentiment for imperial gain, believing he could ride some wave of pan-Islamism.
Whatever his intent, Germany paid an immediate diplomatic price, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That delicate reinsurance treaty with Russia, meant to manage tensions, was just allowed to lapse, despite Russian overtures to keep it going.
Which only intensified Russian fears about German intentions at the Ottoman government.
And further reshaped that already precarious European strategic balance. It really shows how a monarch's personal impulses could just override established foreign policy and create huge international instability.
So the Kaiser lays out this grand vision from on high.
Mm-hmm.
But it needed someone on the ground. Someone to embody it, push it forward, someone intimately familiar, or maybe just claiming to be, with the Near East.
And that brings us to Baron Max von Oppenheim.
Right, born 1860, described as the wayward son of a big banking dynasty. Used his family fortune not for finance, but to moonlight as an explorer, writer, diplomat, archaeologist, prospector.
He was quite the character, a product of his time, definitely, but with a very unconventional streak.
And controversial, you mentioned.
Without a doubt, even by the standards of that golden era of European and particularly German Orientalism.
Tell me more.
Well, his early travels, like his Bildungsreise, that traditional German educational journey to the Maghreb in 1886, he picks up Arabic.
Okay.
But it was there, disturbingly, that he apparently purchased his first concubine from a local slave market, often passed himself off as a Turk.
That's unsettling.
It reveals not just his deeply questionable methods, but his rather chilling interpretation of what he called mastery of the real lingua franca of the Orient.
Oh, superior force.
Wow. And despite all this travel and immersion, his scholarly work didn't make much impact.
Scarcely a ripple in academic circles, McMeekin says.
Yeah.
Perhaps overshadowed by his more dramatic and, sometimes unsettling personal exploits.
When you think about it, his worldview seems remarkably narrow, despite all those experiences.
How so?
Well, his reports from Cairo apparently had this relentless and repetitive quality, constantly defending the Ottoman Empire against the British bogeyman.
Ah, the British bogey.
He saw the Near East as this crude mosaic, just a simple division of pro-German and anti-German groups, dismissed entire populations, like Syrian Christians.
Exactly. Called them unscrupulous and unreliable elements, hostile to Germans simply because they were friends of the Sultan. This simplistic categorization, this us versus them view, seemed to have just blinded him to the real complexities.
And that's precisely where his vision became so problematic and ultimately so flawed. Oppenheim was absolutely convinced that Germany could ride the crest of this wave of anti-British pan-Islamism to world power.
It really highlights the utilitarian, narrow ideology behind the Drying Nachgasten, doesn't it?
Totally. His approach, viewing diverse populations through just this pro- or anti-German lens, inevitably led to profound misjudgments about their real allegiances, their motivations.
He saw a crude mosaic, not complex societies with their own interests, cultures, beliefs.
Which was a fundamental error in his strategic thinking, a massive one.
So we have the Kaiser's sweeping vision, Oppenheim's simplistic yet powerful ideology, and the physical manifestation, the railway itself. But here's where the dreams hit the incredibly frustrating realities of engineering, geopolitics, and local resistance.
Ah, yes, the railway, the Berlin-Baghdad Express.
For many today, that name probably conjures images from, I don't know, Agatha Christie or Graham Greene, maybe even James Bond.
Yeah, and their characters' concerns are almost always exclusively Western, aren't they? Often ignoring the minarets and muezzins of Islam, the whole local context of the lands the railway crossed. It's a very romanticized, almost Orientalist view.
It really takes a leap of imagination, as McMeekin puts it, to get back to the bitter vindiciacal struggles over this railway.
Back then, the Orient was still seen as full of mystery, a romantic dream world, parts of it still partly unmapped. Europeans saw it as the last and potentially greatest frontier of European exploration.
It wasn't just about laying track, it was about claiming this vast, largely unknown landscape.
And Baghdad itself, the name had this mythic grandeur, didn't it?
Absolutely. Conjures images of the 1001 Nights, which, funnily enough, were Oppenheim's boyhood bedtime reading.
But the reality was a bit different. Late 19th century Baghdad, maybe some 150,000 people, a relatively sleepy backwater of the Ottoman Empire.
Which was widely known across Europe as the sick man of Europe by then. Its political, economic decline.
So the ambition to connect Constantinople and Baghdad, 2,000 miles apart, seems almost surreal when you consider those starting points.
Caught that terrain too. Swampy marshland, deserts, and two forbidding mountain ranges. McMeekin calls it a heroic effort.
It's a prime example of that half-mad imperial enterprise fantasiac Europeans excelled in.
That stark contrast between the myth of Baghdad and the harsh reality of the landscape just highlights the immense challenge the Germans took on. This wasn't just laying tracks, it was conquering geography, climate, politics, often with pretty basic technology for the job.
And the sheer scale, the strategic implications immediately drew in the great powers, especially Russia.
They saw it as a direct threat. Right. This was the era of the Great Game, that struggle for influence across Central Asia and the Near East.
Absolutely. Russia, always watching its southern borders, its access to warm water ports, saw any rail construction remotely near the Russian border as a potential casus belli, an act provoking war.
They feared it would speed up Turkish troop deployments to the Caucasus, a region they coveted.
Exactly. That early opposition just underscored the railway's huge strategic importance. Sultan Abdulhamid, though, he saw Germany differently.
As a more reassuring protector against Russia.
Yeah, partly because of Germany's lack of a long German imperial tradition in the region and its geographic remoteness. Plus, he was really impressed by Germany's military mission.
The one credited with improving Ottoman performance in the 1897 war with Greece.
That's the one. Germany seemed like the lesser of many evils to him.
It's fascinating how the Sultan, despite his empire's decline, played that geopolitical game, trying to balance the powers.
He was shrewd, but the financing was a huge issue. That initial 250-mile section, Haydar Pasha into Anatolia, already needed £1 million sterling laid down by British bankers.
And the full line to Baghdad and Basra, hundreds of millions, McMeekin says. A staggering sum.
So German banks, trying to camouflage the project and reduce risk, resorted to selling shares to French and British interests.
To reduce their financial exposure and prevent sabotage or rival bids.
Precisely. The author notes the essential thing was camouflage, making it look less like a purely German project.
But despite the Sultan's backing, the financial tricks, those proliferating capitulations, were a major problem, weren't they?
Huge. They meant Europeans already controlled so much of Ottoman finance infrastructure. These capitulations, these unequal treaties, granted Europeans extensive legal and economic privileges.
Severely limiting the Sultan's autonomy. McMeekin says it made Abdul Hamid something of a guest in his own house.
And he fiercely wanted to reserve final control over the railway's routing himself. That highlights this constant debilitating tension between external investment and internal sovereignty that just plagued the empire, undermined its independence.
And as we move forward, these financial political hurdles just got worse with the tightening of European alliances. The Triple Entente forming really impacted Germany's railway plans.
Definitely. By 1906, the Ottoman government was again facing bankruptcy, a chronic condition by then.
So financial support for the railway needed substantial rises in Ottoman tax and customs duties.
Which, crucially, needed approval from the great powers, France, Britain, Russia, who dominated the Ottoman public debt administration. They held the purse strings.
And the whole diplomatic landscape had shifted dramatically. Germany had London's tacit support, or at least indifference, earlier, 1899, 1903.
But the historic Entente Cordiale with France in 1904, the liberal landslide in Britain in 1905, that changed everything.
Britain was suddenly keen to bury the hatchet with Russia, its old great game rival, consolidate power against a rising Germany.
And ironically, it was Russia, which hadn't signed off on earlier Baghdad concessions, that first petitioned Germany for a new convention in 1906.
What did they propose?
Russian Foreign Minister Izvolsky suggested an imperial bargain. Russia allows construction if Germany recognizes Russian interests in Persia and promises not to build rail or telegraph lines there.
How did Germany react?
German Ambassador Marshall saw through it immediately, called it Russia's old dirty tricks. He warned it was prescient, given what happened next.
The Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907.
Exactly, which cynically divided Persia into zones of influence to guarantee British and Russian positions, shutting Germany out. A clear power play.
So the Triple Entente solidifying in 1907, Britain, France, Russia aligned. It just hardened German resolve to go it alone, financing the railway.
Yeah, this increasing diplomatic and financial isolation pushed Germany deeper into its commitment. They saw the railway as critical to prop up the Sultan's largely phantom authority in distant provinces and project German power east.
Less a shared vision, more a desperate alignment of interests born out of necessity.
And this complex internal Ottoman landscape, constantly shifting, then sets the stage for their dramatic and, for many, shocking entry into World War I, driven by Germany's ultimate weaponizing of pan-Islamism.
As the railway slowly crept forward, section by agonizing section, it coincided with these seismic political shifts within the Ottoman Empire, challenging the very basis of German policy.
Sultan Abdul Hamid, for one, he deeply associated Western-style political reform with imperial humiliation.
You can see why, thinking of the French and British occupations. Tunisia, 1881, Egypt, 1882, both followed periods of Ottoman liberalization. Painful memories.
While German prestige, in contrast, was rising steadily, they seemed to offer a different path, one not based on grabbing territory.
And this context is crucial for understanding the Committee of Union and Progress, the CUP, the Young Turks. They were navigating this incredibly complex, treacherous terrain.
And the German press, aligned with the Kaiser's pro-Hamidian Orient politic, actively smeared Mahmud, the Sultan's half-brother.
Because he was seeking British help to overthrow Abdul Hamid and secure railway concessions for Britain.
Exactly. A clear German attempt to influence internal Ottoman politics, stop British inroads.
German intelligence was deeply involved too, wasn't it? Espionage, not just propaganda.
Oh, yeah. A German agent, Richthofen, operated pretty brazenly as an Ottoman consul in Geneva, sent detailed reports on young Turk agitators to Abdul Hamid's ambassador.
Until Swiss police outed him.
That's right. They even collaborated with the Vatican, yes, the Vatican, to spread rumors against Prince Sabahattin, a rival young Turk leader, baselessly accused him of taking money from the Pope.
Wow. A dirty game of espionage and character assassination,
Whoa.
all to protect German influence.
And Prince Sabahattin's vision, modernizing the caliphate on Western lines, a powerful agent of reconciliation between East and West.
That sounds like something Western liberals would love.
Music to the ears of Western liberals, McMeekin says. But, and this is critical, it was unlikely to inspire much of a following in the Muslim world at large.
A profound misreading by Western powers of the underlying sentiments.
British diplomats struggled too, trying to correct this artfully propagated delusion that if the Sultan was touched, all Islam is wounded. Both powers, in their own ways, just didn't fully grasp the pulse of Islamic sentiment, tried to impose their own frameworks.
And amid all this, the caliphate itself becomes more than just a spiritual symbol. It becomes a geopolitical tool, a battleground for Christian powers to manipulate.
Precisely. The British, for instance, openly tried to detach the caliphate from the Ottoman throne, suggesting, maybe disingenuously, that it is Mecca, not Constantinople, which is the center of the Muslim faith.
A cynical strategy to weaken Abdul Hamid's spiritual authority, especially among Muslims in British India.
And it's often overlooked. But the Ottoman claim on the caliphate rested precariously on military supremacy in Arabia.
Right. So the Sharifiyyat of Mecca, that peculiar institution often flouting Ottoman power, became a prime target for British courting.
British gold, British grain, strategically deployed to buy loyalty, erode Turkish influence in that vital Arabian heartland, creating fault lines the Ottomans couldn't control.
But Oppenheim, he stubbornly clung to his view. Abdul Hamid was Britain's most dangerous enemy.
Relentlessly urged Germany to support the Sultan, speed up the railway, saw the British as perfidious for backing both Sharif Hussein of Mecca and Ibn Saud, creating in his mind two possible candidates for a new caliphate.
This shadowboxing between two Christian powers over the caliphate, McMeekin calls it almost absurd.
Yeah, largely because most educated Muslims themselves no longer took it very seriously as a political force until Abdul Hamid tried to resuscitate pan-Islam. It became, as McMeekin says, a race to the reactionary bottom to see which infidel power could conjure up the purest strain of fundamentalist Islam.
While the Sultan's Muslim subjects, especially non-Islamic minorities, were just lost in the crossfire. Their fates unconsulted, their lives often brutalized under this banner of a revived caliphate manipulated by outsiders.
A truly dangerous game. Then the Young Turk Revolution of 1908 dramatically changes the internal dynamics.
But German calculations stubbornly stay focused on external alliances, on their railway ambitions.
Indeed. The German position in Constantinople actually became quite fragile after the 1908 revolution because of their previous good relations with the Sultan and the palace, the system just overthrown.
A general strike by Turkish railway workers hit the Baghdad line hard too, shows the internal fragility.
Yet oddly, Ahmed Reza, a prominent Young Turk, still sought Germany's protection, shows Germany's perceived strength despite their missteps.
The events of April 1909 were even more dramatic. CUP takes the capital by force, martial law, a clear break.
Endre Bey, a key figure, tries to heal the gaping political breach, symbolically buries Muslims and Christians side by side, proclaims no distinction of race or creed.
Revolutionary stuff, but deeply unsettling for many back then.
Across the board, religious equality was anathema to strict Muslims, McMeekin notes, as were things like women's rights. So the CUP regime, despite progressive rhetoric, faced deep mistrust from strict Muslims.
The British misread them too, didn't they? Saw them as crypto-Jew internationalists.
A deeply inaccurate, problematic assessment. But German Ambassador Marshall, perhaps more presciently, saw them moving sharply to the right towards Ottoman Muslim nationalism, precisely because ordinary Muslims suspected them of fronting for Jewish interests.
So the CUP Congress in 1911 confirms it. Pan-Islam was back in force in their rhetoric, pivoting from secular reform to a more nationalistic, religious appeal for unity.
And despite the Young Turks abrogating all kilometric guarantees for the Baghdad Railway, those financial promises ensuring profitability due to the empire's bankruptcy,
Germany still took the concession.
yeah, even fronted a major new loan, 160 million francs, via a Swiss front company to camouflage German control.
Wow. That commitment, despite the shifting politics, financial risks, broken agreements, it highlights Germany's deep, almost desperate long-term calculation about the railway's importance.
An investment they clearly couldn't afford to abandon, even as things got increasingly volatile.
And this complex, shifting internal landscape sets the stage for the Ottoman Empire's dramatic entry into WWI, driven, in no small part, by Germany's ultimate cynical weaponizing of pan-Islamic sentiment.
The outbreak of World War I sees this dramatic, deeply cynical turn in German strategy, directly from the Kaiser's long fascination with pan-Islam.
July 30th, 1914. Before war is fully declared, Kaiser Wilhelm expresses this chilling desire to inflame the whole Mohammedan world to wild revolt against this hateful, lying, conscienceless people of shopkeepers.
Meaning the British, of course.
Just 3 days later, Moltke, his chief of staff, doubles down, instructs the Foreign Office to awaken the fanaticism of Islam.
This wasn't some fringe idea anymore. It was now central to German war strategy.
A pivotal moment. The jihad stratagem, dismissed by some critics earlier as peripheral, almost fanciful,
now elevated to a central pillar. And while the British were very slow to cotton on, McMeekin notes T. Lawrence didn't even get to Arabia until 1916, years after these plans started.
Right.
The Germans were playing the new game in deadly earnest from the first days of August 1914. Their intent to use religious fervor as a weapon was clear, immediate.
And Max von Oppenheim, the guy rudely disowned by the Foreign Office years before.
Suddenly, he's giving the significant rank of minister in residence, immediately set to work.
Sketching that ambitious blueprint for a global jihad.
Exactly. Berlin as jihad headquarters, churning out anti-Entente propaganda in Arabic, Hindustani, Swahili, targeting British and French colonial subjects.
Aiming to arm Muslim brotherhoods in Libya, Sudan, Yemen, even incite the Emir of Afghanistan to invade British India.
Envisioning this widespread uprising that would cripple the Allied war effort from within.
The Germans were incredibly clever and disturbingly cynical with their propaganda right from the start, weren't they?
Yeah. Strategically planting that story about the two Ottoman dreadnoughts' powerful new warships, commandeered by Britain on July 31st.
Ostensibly built for Turkey, but held back by Britain as war broke out.
Yeah, the Germans claim they were actually gifts from Indian Muslims to the Caliph. Totally fabricated.
But it created much bad blood, resentment against Britain, even before the war officially began.
Showed a sophisticated, though manipulative, understanding of propaganda's power to stir up anti-British sentiment across the Muslim world.
So, with this holy war blueprint designed, Turkey's fateful decision to officially enter the war became the next crucial step. The German war machine needed the Ottomans to fully unleash this global jihad.
And Turkey's entry into WWI was truly fraught with consequences for the whole world.
Led directly to closing the Dardanelles and Bosphorus Straits, impacting Russia, contributing to the revolution.
Paved the way for secret deals like Sykes-Picot carving up the empire, and ultimately the rise of Kemalist Turkey from the ashes.
In hindsight, it might seem inevitable, Turkey joining Germany. But McMeekin points out, Turkey's decision actually drew the other powers in, offered the Ottoman Empire as war booty.
Initial Turkish neutrality was surprisingly genuine. No one knew which way the Ottomans would go for sure in early August 1914.
And Russian ambitions for Constantinople, the Straits. They had plans to seize the Straits by force, by 1917 or 18 anyway, regardless of Turkey's choice.
What's really ironic is that German influence in Constantinople had been in almost total eclipse just before the war. They'd alienated the Young Turks.
So the arrival of those German warships, Goeben and Breslau, in August 1914, fleeing the British fleet, that was the sudden, unexpected turning point.
Absolutely. They were phony purchased by the Ottomans to preserve a facade of neutrality, but that desperate measure disguised their real impact. They effectively dragged Turkey into the war on Germany's side.
And this incident, the sudden influx of German ships, sailors, it gave Turkey immense leverage in negotiations with Germany.
The Porte, the Ottoman government, extracted huge concessions, an unconditional guarantee of Ottoman borders, German agreement to abolish all remaining capitulations, those hated treaties limiting sovereignty, and promises of substantial financial aid.
While the Entente's cynical response was to secretly start planning how to divide the Ottoman Empire among themselves after the war. Predatory intentions laid bare.
From then on, German arms, ammo, wireless gear, medicine, critically, gold, flowed into Constantinople via the Orient Express, including 700 German sailors to man the now supposedly Ottoman ships.
Enver Pasha, the war minister, tried to provoke war in the Black Sea with those ships right away.
He did, but was initially overruled by the Grand Vizier. But by October 1914, Enver, Talat, and Jamal the Young Turk triumvirate secretly agreed. Unleash Admiral Suchan's German warships against Russia.
In exchange for a $5 million loan and a monthly subsidy.
That's right. The Black Sea naval assault on October 29th directly coincided with a jihadi uprising in Egypt. Shows a coordinated, if desperate, effort to ignite the larger Holy War.
And with Turkey officially, if secretly, in the war, the symbolic, hugely controversial declaration of jihad quickly followed, aiming to ignite that wider Muslim uprising against the Entente. This was the moment the Kaiser's vision took concrete, perilous form.
November 14, 1914, Fatih Sultan Mehmed Mosque in Constantinople, the Sheikhul Islam, the highest religious authority, formally presents Sultan Caliph Mehmed Rashad Rave with the sword of the Prophet.
To sanctify the war against Britain, France, and Russia. The public launch of the Holy War.
But the legally problematic nature of this declaration is absolutely key. Its impetus came directly from the German government. They encouraged it, even subsidized the theological language used.
And it controversially named neutral countries like Belgium and Serbia as targets,
Yeah.
while specifically exempting U.S. citizens.
Exactly. A transparent attempt to keep America out. Revealed the opportunistic, manipulative nature, serving German and Ottoman strategic interests above genuine religious principle.
Austrian Ambassador Pallavicini saw the danger, didn't he?
He was acutely sensitive to the Pandora's box of problems this Turco-German holy war might open, feared massacres, a worst possible impression on neutrals like Italy, America, understood the potential for widespread violence, diplomatic backlash.
And on the ground in Constantinople, witnesses saw mobs marching, waving large green flags, dervishes howling and waving blood-soaked pieces of cloth.
A highly volatile, frenzied atmosphere, a deliberate spectacle to whip up fervent religious emotion regardless of consequences.
And this wasn't a traditional limited call to arms, that infamous verse of the sword, Surah 9.5, from Quranic passages in the pamphlets.
Exhorted Muslims to slay infidels wherever you find them, explicitly including civilians.
Oppenheim's pamphlet pushed it further, specified the blood of the infidels in the Islamic lands may be shed with impunity.
A new, frighteningly expanded form of jihad, beyond traditional jihad by campaigns, though it conveniently provided airtight immunity for Germans and neutrals, highly selective, self-serving interpretation of doctrine, twisted for military and political ends.
U.S. Ambassador Morgenthau, understanding the danger to civilians, did all he could to extract promises to protect Entente nationals, distributed American flags for protection.
Some Ottoman officials, like the Valley of Smyrna, cooperated. But others, like Jamal Pasha, snapped, "I do not authorize you to meddle with my affairs," showed internal tensions, a chilling disregard for potential consequences.
So holy war declared. German and Ottoman agents fan out across the Middle East and beyond, trying to turn the abstract declaration into concrete action.
Yeah.
And a primary target, the Suez Canal, the jugular vein of the British Empire.
The stated strategic objective of the Turco-German jihad in the Middle East was that decisive blow at Suez. Force Britain to divert critical troops from the Western Front, ease pressure on Germany, a massive high-stakes gamble.
But fraught with immense, almost insurmountable challenges.
Totally. The Baghdad Railway, for all its ambition, still had large gaps. Munitions, rifles, artillery shells had to be offloaded, transferred to primitive mule caravans through treacherous desert.
And the Sinai Desert itself lacked good roads or track, reliable wells for drinking water,
Yeah.
made a large-scale offensive incredibly hard to sustain.
Plus, British naval control of the seas made staging diversionary gambits or amphibious landings nearly impossible, isolated the land offensive.
And the field agents struggled too, didn't they? Translating grand strategy into local action.
Otto Mannesmann's mission to Cyrenaica, trying to stir the Senussi tribesmen of Libya against British Egypt. Their shrewd leader, Sheikh Ahmad al-Sharif, demanded sufficient material assistance first. Pragmatic, no fighting on empty promises.
Leo Frobenius' mission to Eritrea, Abyssinia, Sudan faced cultural faux pas, armed encounters, while British gold eroded Turkish power in the Hejaz.
And Alois Musil, the expert on Bedouins, tasked with rallying tribal support.
His unromantic view of tribal life, his cold analysis of Arabian power politics, revealed a harsh truth. Bedouins were, in his frank assessment, not jihad material.
Their mentality was tribal, not religious, driven by fresh loot, immediate gain, not ideology.
Exactly. He noted awful health conditions too, cholera, syphilis, undermining sustained campaigns. Crucially, Musil refused even to try to win over the North Arabian tribes for Suez. Said, without the necessary funds, he couldn't equip or motivate them. A realist among fantasists.
The first Suez attack, February 1915, led by Jamal, German Colonel Kress, encapsulated all these challenges.
Grueling march, weeks long, across waterless desert. Soldiers drinking wicked-tasting, barely drinkable water.
Symbolic elements deployed too. Mev Levy whirling dervishes, the holy war banner from Mecca.
But British aerial reconnaissance had accurately estimated enemy strength, positioned defenses.
It was not a fair fight. Result, murderous machine gun fire, immediate desertion by Bedouins, Arab regulars who had no stomach for suicidal charges.
Proofer, the dragoman observing the debacle, concluded, the Holy War is a tragic comedy.
A spectacular failure. Starkly revealed Muslim solidarity was a phantom on a serious battlefield. The German strategy, deeply flawed in understanding the region's people, terrain.
But the devastating failure at Suez didn't stop German ambitions elsewhere. The focus just shifted, pivoted towards the greater game in Mesopotamia, Persia. Different theater, same grand imperial ambitions.
German efforts extended into the Shia heartland of southern Mesopotamia, trying to win over Shia Muslims for the Holy War proclaimed by the Sunni Sheikhul Islam.
An incredibly delicate, complex piece of cultural diplomacy, given the centuries-old Sunni-Shia divide.
Speaks to their desperation, doesn't it? To find any way to ignite the jihad. Mission led by Captain Fritz Klein, German archaeologists like Hans Lurs.
Lurs observed the solitude and solemnity of the plains, where the dead seemed more real than the living, highlighting the Shia cult of martyrdom around sites like Karbala.
Yeah. Klein faced frustrating encounters with the local mufti. What one said mattered less than how one said it. Subtle gestures, manners, stark contrast to Western directness.
And the presence of wealthy British Indian Muslims funding guest houses around the sacred tombs presented both an opportunity for propaganda and a problem, as they often had pro-British leanings.
Then there was that audacious mission to Afghanistan, aiming to incite mutiny in British India. Catastrophic for the British if it worked.
Oppenheim, back in Berlin, assembled an Indian Revolutionary Committee to support it.
But the mission was plagued by logistical nightmares, a comedy of errors. German agent Wasmus, key figure, lost his diplomatic codebook,
allowing the British to regularly intercept German communications. Read, Cipher No 3500.
Exactly. This accidental intelligence coup severely compromised German operations from the start, gave the British a huge advantage.
Despite that, German agents like Niedermayer engaged in espionage and sabotage in grand style in Persia, forced British consuls to flee.
Max Otto Schünemann, former carpet trader turned spy, single-handedly chased the Russian consul out of town in one dramatic incident.
So the race for Kabul became paramount. Werner Otto von Hentig bringing lavish gifts, Indian revolutionaries to Emir Habibullah. Hopes were high.
But Habibullah, the emir, proved incredibly cautious and, crucially, European in both his habits and his political calculations.
Treated jihad as mere business, not ideology. Purely tactical advantage, financial gain.
Wasn't easily swayed by magic beans, grand promises, knew exactly how to play the imperial powers off against each other, foreshadowed the severe limits of the Holy War strategy against pragmatic local leadership, a fundamental miscalculation by the Germans.
These ambitious, often ill-fated missions. Logistical failures, cultural misunderstandings, shrewd local leaders. They underscore growing tensions, profound realignments within the German-Ottoman alliance itself, leading to significant, bitter rifts.
The Ottoman victory at Gallipoli in 1915, monumental achievement for the Turks, heroic defense, shattered Allied hopes of seizing the Straits.
But widely attributed to military discipline, strategic genius like Mustafa Kemal's, not the Holy War.
In fact, German commander Lehmann von Sanders, who was there, thought little of the Holy War schemes, called them obscure fantasies, actively sabotaged Oppenheim's agents, saw them as more trouble than they were worth.
Even Mustafa Kemal, hero of Gallipoli, was so cold to pan-Islam that he would one day completely dispose of the caliphate. This fundamental disagreement on strategy widened the rift, despite the shared enemy.
Indeed. German ambassador Wangenheim noted an unmistakable discord against Germany, reported 90% of the Turks frankly hated the Germans during the Dardanelles crisis, even as their lives depended on German aid.
There were even discussions within the port to surrender the straits preemptively to the Allies, fearing a German collapse, wanting to save themselves.
Shows the deep animosity brewing beneath the surface, profound mistrust, a far cry from the initial Berlin-Baghdad Axis vision.
And then, Sharif Hussein's revolt, June 1916, dealt a far more serious threat to the empire than Suez, struck at the spiritual heart of the caliphate.
Hussein's proclamation called for rebellion against the CUP, accused them of making the caliphate moribund by deposing Abdul Hamid, introducing secular reforms like equal rights for women and religious minorities.
Largely British propaganda, but it hit home because of the CUP's controversial actions alienating traditional Muslims.
British support for Hussein was calculated, detached the caliphate from the Ottoman throne, support one Muslim faction against another to destabilize their enemy from within.
What about the tensions within the Ottoman army itself, between German and Turkish officers?
Constant simmering tensions present from day one, awkward age differences, younger Turkish officers outranking experienced Germans led to insurmountable antipathy. German officers threatened to go home.
Turks implemented aggressive Turkification policies, too, requiring Germans to use Turkish, wear the fez, Turkish uniforms.
So as not to become targets of popular rage from the resentful Turkish populace, not just cultural sensitivity, about control, deflecting blame.
And the financial side fueled huge resentment. Turkish government, emboldened, desperate for funds, demanded German acceptance of abolition of the capitulations in perpetuity, abrogation of hated treaties limiting sovereignty, massive ask.
Germany had poured 250 million Turkish pounds of capital, about $125 billion today, into railways aid. Yet the port paid less than 16,000 of the sunk cost.
Germans felt deeply underappreciated, saw Turkey as extortionate, fueled immense bitterness, sense of betrayal.
This internal friction, coupled with external pressures, only intensified as the war dragged on, bringing the crushing weight of continuous conflict onto the fragile Ottoman Empire.
By summer 1916, the Ottoman Empire enters its sixth year of its own ongoing war of survival, fought almost continuously since 1911. Human, material toll, immense, pushed to the absolute brink.
And the Russian offensives of 1916. Catastrophic for Turkey, fall of key cities, Erzurum, Trabzon, Mus, Bitlis, Erzincan.
The ancient enemy of the Turks, sweeping through the heartland of Anatolia, caused even greater panic in Constantinople than when the Allied fleet arrived in the Straits.
Germany, as principal sponsor and cheerleader, naturally took the lion's share of the blame for these calamities, further strained the fragile alliance.
Turkish officers were exasperated by the German presence, complained bitterly all the best houses and hotels in Pera and on the Bosphorus have been requisitioned by German officers. Symbol of German overreach, arrogance.
There were even open discussions among Turkish officials of a frightful massacre of German soldiers if they didn't leave. Shows how deep the resentment ran, how close the alliance was to collapse.
The symbolic importance of Baghdad cannot be overstated. For Islamic history, for German imperial dreams, its fall to the British, March 1917, without a fight.
A crushing reversal for Germany's Berlin to Baghdad dreams, a symbolic end.
Austrian reports noted German unconcealed schadenfreude, malicious delight at Turkish defeats, believing the Turks would have to rely on themselves and it was self-evident that it would end badly.
Shows the deep bitterness, dysfunction within the alliance, a partnership of convenience unraveling under war's weight.
Despite crushing setbacks, bitter animosity, the Russian revolutions of 1917 suddenly offered a dramatic, if fleeting, new opportunity for Germany. Pursue Eastern ambitions, maybe even at the expense of its unreliable Turkish ally, set the stage for the ultimate demise of the original drawing nach Osten.
The Russian revolutions, February, then Bolshevik, October 1917, marked a critical caesura in WWI, fundamentally altered the Eastern Front.
Germany immediately saw an unprecedented opportunity. Its drawing nach Osten could resume, maybe on new terms, if Lenin and the Bolsheviks knocked Russia out of the war.
A desperate gamble, huge potential payoff. The Ottoman Third Army was at breaking point by February 1917. Hemorrhaging deserters, utterly exhausted.
Sudden, chaotic collapse of the Tsarist army opened vast, vulnerable territory in the east, including the strategic Transcaucasus, became the new prize for the Central Powers, a vacuum ripe for filling.
Turkish newspapers, Talat himself, loudly advocating the immediate recovery of lands in eastern Anatolia and Transcaucasia. Ambition wasn't just restoring 1914 borders, reverse all Russian gains from 1877 war, expand further into the Caucasus.
Highlighted a growing Turkish nationalism, imperial ambition that now, ironically, directly clashed with Germany's own designs there.
German Ambassador Bernstorff bluntly declared Turkey nothing more to us now than a political, military, financial, and moral burden. Stated German intentions to exploit Russian collapse for their own gains, not share spoils equitably.
New German strategy pivoted sharply, centered on seizing the Transcaucasian Railway and oil pipeline through Batumi, Tiflis, Baku, marked a shift in the great game away from the stalled Baghdad line.
This clash of allied interests, each eyeing the same prize, came to a head in the fraught Brest-Litovsk negotiations and the subsequent frantic race for Baku.
Brest-Litovsk, December 1917. Central Powers impose a punitive, brutal peace on Bolshevik Russia, takes Russia out.
Baku, vital oil fields, strategic access to Central Asia, now a glittering prize, coveted by both Turks and Germans.
Trotsky's no war, no peace, Gambit refusing to sign, but declaring war over believing time was on his side, revolutions would sweep Europe. Ultimately infuriated the Central Powers, no mood for delays.
General Hoffman's most comic war illustrates the chaos. German forces advanced by train, few infantry seizing deserted stations. Bizarre, almost bloodless push.
But Enver Pasha, ignoring German displeasure, seeing opportunity, ordered a unilateral Third Army offensive into the Caucasus, January 1918.
Led to bloody clashes between Armenian partisans, government forces. Turkish forces justified advance, claiming the Armenians are resolved to destroy and annihilate Ottoman Muslims. Fall of Kars, April 1918, symbolized this renewed, aggressive Turkish expansion.
This unilateral Turkish push meant the Turco-German partnership now threatened to go off the rails, just as victory beckoned in the east.
Colonel Kress, German plenipotentiary in Tiflis, openly sabotaged the Turkish advance, formed a Germano-Georgian alliance specifically to block them from Baku's oil.
It became the most serious crisis in German-Ottoman relations, forced Ludendorff to send Hans von Sicht to intervene, try to restore some Allied cooperation. But the damage was done.
Despite German intervention attempts, Nuri Pasha's army of Islam pan-Turkic, not pan-Islamic interests, clashed violently with Armenian militias, newly arriving British troops in the desperate race for Baku.
When Nuri's army finally crashed into Baku, September 15, 1918, followed by horrific Armenian massacres, the news received in Berlin with little more than indifference.
By then, the Western Front was crumbling. Baku's fate seemed irrelevant, facing Germany's impending inevitable defeat.
The capture of Baku was a hollow victory for the Porte, swiftly undone by the war's end. Profound ironies for both Germany and Turkey. Stark reminder how quickly wartime gains evaporate.
The Mudros Armistice, October 1918, ending fighting for the Ottomans, forced their army to evacuate Transcaucasia, negated all gains in Baku elsewhere. Complete, swift reversal.
Paradoxically, Turkey arguably gained as much as any other belligerent out of the wreckage of the First World War, despite losing vast territories.
They successfully fought their war of independence, established modern Kemalist Turkey, critically finally abolished the capitulations forever, freed their sovereignty economy.
For Germany, a crushing reversal, lost all political influence, grand railway dreams, huge investments poured into the region.
The greatest irony, McMeekin points out, is the two powers fated to fill the vacuum left by Germany's failed Drawn nach Osten.
Kemalist, Turkey secular nationalist, far from pan-Islamist ideals, and Bolshevik Russia.
The Kaiser's pan-Islamic gambit, meant to destabilize Britain and Russia, ultimately brought Muslim Central Asia, the Caucasus, under Russian, not German, influence for decades. Shows how grand designs, especially based on cynical manipulation, often yield unintended, contrary outcomes, shaping history far more profoundly than initial intentions.
Which leads us to the truly disturbing epilogue. The chilling transformation of German pan-Islamism, even elements of Zionism, into something far more sinister tragic than anyone initially foresaw.
The chapter highlights these seemingly identical interests at the war's start, or convenient convergences. Russian Jews and those of the German Reich, as Max Bodenheimer, German Zionist leader, put it.
Russian revolutionaries and Germany, according to Parvez Hilpand. Islam and Germany, proclaimed by figures like Faisal, a tangled web of alliances based on shared enemies, not shared values.
What's particularly complex is how British intelligence consistently misinterpreted the Young Turk Revolution, saw it as work of crypto-Jewish Freemasonry, feeding anti-Semitic tropes.
Similarly, many Britons later blamed the Russian Revolution on an apparent conjunction of Bolsheviks, Germans, and Jews. Dangerous conspiracy theory.
While grossly exaggerated, baseless, the German Foreign Office had indeed explored the confluence of interest between Germany and Zionism, saw an opportunity to destabilize enemies.
Max Bodenheimer, German Zionist Federation president, initially pledged to support those powers lined up against Russia, Russia being a major oppressor of Jews. Envision an East European federation in formerly Russian Jewish territories under German influence.
German propaganda leaflets, printed in Yiddish, dropped behind Russian lines, urged Jews to support Germany. Tragically, this strategy, despite intent, triggered off unwarranted suspicions of espionage among panicked Russian authorities, led directly to mass expulsions of Jews from Russian Poland and Galicia, displaced hundreds of thousands.
Shows the complex, contradictory relationships. Driven by wartime pragmatism, Jamal Pasha's initial harsh anti-Zionist crackdown in Palestine later found Jewish engineers so skillful and trustworthy, rebuilding infrastructure, he rejected an offer from Berlin to provide, German technicians preferring Jewish expertise.
Yet even then, Arab hostility to Jews in Palestine, fueled by land purchases, Zionist aspirations, was overwhelming. These pragmatic, cynical wartime alliances reveal a deeply unsettling undercurrent of manipulation, expedient betrayals.
And this brings us to the truly dark turn in the legacy, the descent into darkness. Figures like Prüfer, Oppenheim, their later horrifying connections to the Nazis.
After 1918, gripped by crushing defeat, many Germans, caught in McMeekin's poisonous brew of self-pity, sought scapegoats, blamed defeat on a cabal of Jewish-cum-socialist politicians, laid groundwork for virulent anti-Semitism.
Kurt Prüfer, the intelligent dragoman from earlier, bitterly transformed.
Angrily blamed defeat on the Jewish slogan, "Shed no blood," wrote it was repulsive to see how the stupid Germans allow themselves to be ensnared by international Jewry. Later offered services to the Nazis, actively helped Nazify the Foreign Office and cleanse it of Jewish influence. A chilling trajectory.
What's truly shocking is even Max von Oppenheim, despite his own Jewish ancestry family converted to Protestantism, openly endorsed race murder in both WWI and WWII, according to the book.
Horrifyingly, in 1940, advised Hitler to support his friend, al-Husseini, Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, in efforts to cleanse British Palestine of Jews.
Al-Husseini, with his long, violent history, inciting pogroms against Palestinian Jews in 1920, 21, 29, 36.
That's him. Hitler readily promised the Mufti an uncompromising struggle against the Jews, including preventing the formation of a Jewish state in Palestine. The threads of history here are chillingly direct.
The author suggests this virulent anti-Semitism was born not just externally, but from an internal feeling. That Germans, having done pretty well for themselves, were substantially responsible for the catastrophe of WWI, leading them to seek external scapegoats.
To absolve themselves, the farmable seeds of tragedy from WWI's farce were indeed sown in this period of self-pity, blame, cynical manipulation of identities.
In the final, perhaps most profound irony, the Kaiser consciously chosen not to base his regional policy on Zionism, despite its potential against Russia, saw pan-Islam as the greater tool.
Zionists, despite efforts, propaganda ultimately did only token damage to the Ottoman position. Instead, that very focus on pan-Islam, while unreliable in wartime application,
Tragically provided the ideological pathway for the later horrifying Nazi-Muslim connection, a direct, deeply unsettling legacy casting a long shadow over the 20th century.
So we've taken quite a deep dive into Germany's incredibly ambitious Drang nach Osten, symbolized by that dream of the Berlin-Baghdad Express, championed by figures like Kaiser Wilhelm II, Baron Max von Oppenheim.
Yeah, we've seen how these imperial dreams entangled, often violently, with the complex realities of the Ottoman Empire, from manipulating the caliphate to those ill-fated holy war missions and the deepening bitter rifts within the alliance itself.
This story reveals a history far richer, more unsettling, and definitely more consequential than simple narratives might suggest.
The attempts to weaponize religious identity, the clash of grand visions with complex local realities, the unpredictable, often catastrophic consequences of international power plays. These themes just resonate so deeply in our world today.
Absolutely. The echoes of these historical events can still be felt, especially in the Middle East, but also beyond, reminding us of the enduring legacy of decisions made a century ago, decisions that prioritize cynical power over genuine understanding.
So what does this all mean for how we understand the complex interplay of power, religion, identity in our own time? How do grand visions so often falter against local realities?
And how do unintended consequences shape history far more profoundly than initial intentions, sometimes leading, as McMeekin puts it, to the farmable seeds of future tragedies?
What stands out to you listening from this intricate historical tapestry, and what lessons might it hold for navigating the world's complexities today?